Welcome. It's becoming a tradition here that from time to time I share with you a book that is deeply meaningful to me and that I feel is also going to be deeply meaningful to you. Today it's going to be more of a topic rather than one particular book, and I'll be quoting just a little bit from different books concerning the same topic. Now, whenever we talk about books or topics here, it's not an academic discussion. It's not about ultimately anything outside of you. It is just one way of looking at the essential truth that is inseparable from who you are. And so that applies to any spiritual teaching. It would be pointless to discuss a spiritual teaching as a subject outside of you, although that's done a lot at universities. And in that way you can accumulate knowledge. But basically what that means is that you are a collector of maps and you're discussing the merits or otherwise of maps and compare them, compare one map to other maps, but never go to where the map points. You never go to the territory, you just look at the map of the territory, and that would be studying these things as a subject outside of you, as it's done academically. And if you enjoy that, that's fine, it's just another activity, another way of accumulating knowledge, but it is not a way of knowing, arriving at that place within yourself where conceptual knowledge is transcended and where you know from the depth of your being. And that's of course what ultimately all the spiritual teachings are about, for you to find that place. Spiritual teachings are not here to ultimately give you information, but to help you uncover that which is already a reality within you. In that sense, nothing needs to be added to you. And while we are here now, spending some time, I'm not adding anything to you, but what we are attempting to do is using, in this case, a spiritual teaching that is quite old, ancient, but still alive, using that as a way of accessing the deeper dimension in yourself. So it should be quite enjoyable. If it's not enjoyable, it's not working. So we can relax. There's nowhere to go as such on the horizontal dimension of life, but only go more deeply into the vertical, so nowhere to go in terms of space and time. When I don't remember, when it was many years ago, my brother or half-brother came to see me. My brother is 20 years younger than me, and at that time he was 17. He came to see me and said, I just saw a movie. It's an Indiana Jones movie, I think that's what it was. And he said, you should see that because there's a character in there that's just like you. So I said, well, that's strange. What am I doing in an Indiana Jones movie? He said, well, he doesn't look like you at all, but he is like you. I can't explain. He said, you'll just have to see it. So my curiosity aroused. Following week, I went to see the movie. And I was pleasantly surprised. This character turned out to be a Sufi master, a relatively young man. And the title of the movie was The Jewel of the Nile. Not particularly profound film, entertaining with a lot of action, but it had this character who played a Sufi master, and the exceptional thing about the film, and my brother must have intuited that, the exceptional thing about the film was that this character, the Sufi master, functions in the film with virtually no ego. So he's whether the scriptwriter or the director did that consciously or whether they were guided and it just turned out that way unconsciously, I don't know. But it's a wonderful teaching just to watch this character move about and speak from an egoless place. So if you ever want to see it, it's called The Jewel of the Nile. It's probably still available in DVD. It's just worth seeing for this character. So that's a Sufi. And then I became more interested in the Sufis. I had heard of Sufis, as most people have. Sufism goes back a long, long time, over 1,000 years. And it's usually described as the mystical branch of Islam. And when one speaks of Sufis, and what comes to mind for most people, unless they haven't even heard of that, is the whirling dervishes, dervishes are Sufis who have taken vows of poverty, and they perform ecstatic dances. They go round and round in circles, so they're the whirling dervishes. And they're even howling dervishes and singing dervishes, so they have practices that are quite vigorous and undoubtedly result in the cessation of thinking, because you can't be whirling around like that and still continue to think. So anyway, I became a bit more interested in the Sufis, and I looked at a few books, and I saw that the Sufi masters all point to that most essential place within you. And their teaching, although it came out of Islam, it transcends, as every true, deep spiritual teaching does, it transcends the form out of which it comes. In the same way that, for example, Zen, or that's come out of Buddhism, transcends Buddhism, in the same way that the great Christian mystics of the Middle Ages transcend the narrow form of Christianity. And of course, very often they were persecuted for that by Orthodox Christians, in the same way that the Sufis were, some of them, were persecuted and killed by Orthodox Muslims, and still are. Nowadays especially, when we speak of Islam, we think of it as or many people think of it as an intolerant religion, but any religion can be turned into that. And if you look back to the Middle Ages, you'll see that Islam was far more tolerant at that time than Christianity. And Islam at that time had a far more highly developed civilization than the Christian civilization of Europe, or Central Europe. Islam was in Southern Europe also. So today I'd like to go with you as deeply as possible into the heart of the Sufi teachings, or use the Sufi teachings as a device to access that place within yourself. I was happy to see, before we go into all that, I was happy to see a few months ago an article in the New York Times where the Pacific, the very peaceful nature of Sufism was acknowledged, and where they reported that even nowadays Sufism is regarded by the Orthodox fanatics as an enemy of Islam. And I'm going to just read to you, before we go into it, a little clipping from the New York Times. It was written a few months ago about Sufism nowadays. In the most radical parts of the Muslim world, Sufi leaders risk their lives for their tolerant beliefs every bit as bravely as American troops on the ground in Baghdad and Kabul do. Sufism is the most pluralistic incarnation of Islam, accessible to the learned and the ignorant, the faithful and non-believers, and is thus a uniquely valuable bridge between East and West. The great Sufi saints, like the 13th century Persian poet Rumi, held that all existence and all religions were one, all manifestations of the same divine reality. What was important was not the empty ritual of the mosque, church, synagogue or temple, but the striving to understand that divinity can best be reached through the gateway of the human heart. That we all can find paradise within us if we know where to look. In some ways, Sufism, with its emphasis on love rather than judgment, represents the New Testament of Islam. While the West remains blind to the divisions and distinctions within Islam, the challenge posed by the Sufi vision of the faith is not lost on the extremists. This was shown most violently on July the 2nd, last year, when the Pakistani Taliban organized a double suicide bombing of the Data Darbar, the largest Sufi shrine in Lahore, Pakistan's second largest city. The attack took place on a Thursday night when the shrine was at its busiest. 42 people were killed and 175 were injured. This was only the latest in a series of assaults against Pakistan's Sufis. And then it goes on to talk about other attacks on the Sufis. It's always the case for those in whom the religion is only an ideology. They will regard anybody who truly lives the essence of that religion as an enemy. whether this happened a lot in Christianity in the past, it can happen with any religion. So let's go more deeply into the essence of the Sufis. I'll be quoting to you from a few books, and mostly it'll be just very short stories of teachings by Sufi masters. I will read a little teaching and then I will comment on it. And later on we're going to read a few poems by the great Sufi master and poet Hafiz, and perhaps a few by Rumi. There are many books that you can buy on Sufism. It doesn't really matter which one. Of course, we have today here The Gift, which is poems by Hafiz. And I'll be quoting just one or two little things from The Way of the Sufi, whether this is still in print, I think it is. Idris Shah. This is a book that somebody gave me, which contains writings from sacred writings from world religions. A lovely book which could be a Bible for our times, the world's wisdom, transcending the boundaries, the narrow boundaries of religion. This is one of the shortest of all poems by a Sufi master, Firdausi, who lived around the year 1000. If on earth there be a paradise of bliss, it is this, it is this, it is this. Bliss, joy, aliveness is hiding in this moment. So you need to access the depths of this moment to find the paradise of bliss that most people look for as if it were an object that can be found in the future. There's also, of course, a similar famous saying that comes from Zen, this is it. Liberation then lies in accessing the power that is concealed in this moment. Taking your attention deeply into this moment, where the whole structure of conceptual reality no longer operates. If on earth there be a paradise of bliss, it is this, it is this, it is this. You cannot understand this through concepts or explanations. That understanding needs to be direct. The moment you ask, yes, but what about, that won't get you there. Rumi, the great Persian Sufi poet, one of the greatest poets that ever lived, says, there is a force within that gives you life. Seek that. In your body there lies a priceless jewel. Seek that. O wandering Sufi, if you are in search of the greatest treasure, don't look outside. Look within and seek that. Direct your attention within. There's a force within that gives you life. Seek that. Just those lines, if you use them as a pointer, can be extremely powerful. There's a force within that gives you life. Seek that. In other words, becoming aware of the life that you are. Directly becoming aware of that animating presence. I wouldn't even say that animating presence in you. That's language that already falsifies things. But becoming aware of the animating presence that you are. It's not that the animating presence is in you. The animating presence is who you are and what you are. Language, the moment we use language, we create duality. So at this moment, can you become aware of that, of the life in you? It's so all-pervasive and so obvious that you overlook it. In the same way that a fish probably is not aware of water. Can you sense your own presence beyond thinking, not without which there could be no thinking, but the presence that is prior to thinking, right now. Nothing to do with your history. There you're touching the essence, the transcendent dimension in you. Where, what is it that is transcended? All that is form in you. Thinking, emotions, sense perceptions. How is it that you can be aware of any of these things? How is it that there can be thoughts? How is it that there can be sense perceptions? How is it that there can be emotions or feelings? Because of the underlying presence, the life, the formless life or consciousness. Now, if you could be aware of that all the time in your daily life, then you would be free of attachment to things and free of attachment to the mental image of who you are, which is the ego. And the next little piece I'll read is about that. Remembrance of God. This is by, excuse my Arabic, Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Kair, who lived from 967 to 1049. The true man of God, man or woman, the true man or woman of God sits in the midst of his fellow men and rises and eats and sleeps and marries and buys and sells and gives and takes in the bazaars and spends the days with other people and yet never forgets God even for a single moment. In a second I'll read that again. Never forgets God even for a single moment. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean whatever this person is doing, he always thinks, I must think about God. I have to God. When he buys something, he thinks, God, God, God. Obviously, that's not it. That would be a form of insanity. There's a similar thing that Jesus says, pray without ceasing. And I don't believe he can mean that you go around continuously, Our Father who art in heaven, while you're buying things and talking to somebody. It's just not possible. So they're not talking about that. And so when he says, never forgets God even for a single moment, he's not saying always thinks about God every single moment. You can't do that. That would be madness. So, God is not a mental object. For many people, God has been reduced to an idea in their mind that they believe in. And of course there are others who also have the idea of God and deny it. One person says, I believe in this idea of God, the concept of God. The other one, the concept becomes it. So it's a kind of mental idol that you can accept or reject, but even if you accept it, it's not the reality. It's just a thought, and you can't have that thought continuously. So, he's talking about not a thought, but a knowing that is non-conceptual at the back of your mind, or at the back of you, in the background. And this connects with what we said in the previous piece, what we read. There is a force in you. What was it? There's a force within that gives you life, seek that. This presence, this conscious presence, is that which makes everything possible. That it is the light in which everything appears. Now that, I sometimes describe it as stillness, as light, as space, the inner space within you, a field of a space, a still space, but highly conscious, alive, a knowing. The art of living then is to have that in the background while you deal with life in the foreground. That is the art. You have to practice that. Once you've mastered it, then you have fulfilled your purpose here. And yet, never forgets God even for a single moment. In other words then, This person who never forgets God even for a single moment is aware not only of all the things that make up sense-perceived existence, and including thoughts, but he or she is also aware of the space in which all these things appear. So you are the space for that. So in other words, then you carry around a stillness at the back of you, a space, a stillness, even while you sell and buy in the bazaars. Well, nowadays it's the shopping malls. So while you're walking in the shopping mall, and while you're picking something up to buy, you're not totally lost in the objects of your life, whether they are external objects or inner objects that arise, because that means you forget God. Otherwise, you lose yourself in things, and things impinge upon you. You think your happiness and your peace depends on things. Things include, of course, mental objects also, not just physical objects. Mental objects are also things. So people depend on their ideology for their sense of self, for example. Completely lost in things also, the same as the person who depends on material possessions. Completely lost in things. You give your life over to things, either external things, or you give your life over to some fixed ideas, repetitive ideas in your mind. Completely lost in that. So, it is possible to know God continuously, even as you go about your daily life. And that is the teaching of the Sufis and any other spiritual teaching. But of course, to be identified with things means to be virtually asleep. So again, the Sufis also talk about waking up in the same way that other spiritual traditions do, the importance of, as Jesus puts it, staying awake, the importance of being the one who is awake, the Buddha, that's what it means. And Rumi says, if you want great wealth and that which lasts forever, wake up. If you want to shine with the love of the beloved in Sufi language is God. If you want to shine with the love of the beloved, wake up. You've slept 100 nights, and what has it brought you? For yourself, for your God, wake up, sleep no more. And in this little poem here that I'm going to read now, Rumi talks about the evolution on this planet, how consciousness evolves gradually and becomes different life forms. And that consciousness that manifests as different life forms is, of course, the one consciousness, the one God. And this is why Rumi talks of it as I. I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to animal. I died as an animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die as a man, to soar with angels blessed. But even from angelhood I must pass on. He describes in one little poem, briefly, the whole evolution of consciousness on the planet and the destiny of man. And perhaps the most wonderful line is, when was I less by dying? Dying is only the metamorphosis of form. And dying is not just the dying of the physical body. Dying happens on a daily basis. Things come to an end, forms in your life dissolve. It would be suffering to expect otherwise, and yet most people do. They get anxious when things begin to change and go away, leave them. Sometimes Sufis are called lovers of leaving, not afraid of transformation. One more poem by Rumi, I believe. Sufis are very light-hearted, joyful. Without joy, it is not the true teaching. So Rumi says, this is a call, and these poems originally were spoken aloud, as they're meant to be. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving, it doesn't matter. Ours is a caravan of endless joy. Even if you've broken your vows 100 times, come, come, yet again, come. There's exuberant aliveness in the Sufi teachers. Now they all recognize, all traditions recognize that the main obstacle to realization is what in Buddhism is called the self, or what we could call the ego. In other words, a false sense of identity that creates an illusory sense of self and an illusory world that you experience, full of drama and unnecessary suffering. And a lot of the Sufi teaching, some of it is very practical. People traditionally went to see a master over many years and be close to the master, and the master would sometimes tell them what to do. And those teachings are designed to gradually free you of the false sense of self, which is the ego. Here we have a wonderful little story that explains that. One Sufi master was asked, Shibli was his name, he was asked, who guided you on your path? And he said, a dog. A dog? Yes. One day I saw him, almost dead with thirst, standing by the water's edge. Every time he looked at his reflection in the water, he was frightened and withdrew, because he thought it was another dog. Finally, such was his necessity, he cast away fear and leapt into the water, at which the other dog vanished. The dog found that the obstacle, which was himself, the barrier between him and what he sought, melted away. In this same way, my own obstacle vanished, said the master, when I knew that it was what I took to be my own self. So that was the obstacle, what he took to be his own self was the obstacle. And my way was first shown to me by the behavior of a dog. So the dog jumped. First, the barrier between what the dog was seeking, the barrier that prevented him from obtaining that which the dog was seeking, was the illusory image of himself, the delusion that there was that other self, the self. So this teacher must have gone very far already on the road of self-realization, and then sometimes only a tiny thing is necessary where you suddenly see the truth of it. So when he saw the dog jump into the water, he suddenly realized his own obstacle was there was still a remnant of a mind-made sense of self. And that then dissolved. The ego dissolved. There's a wonderful story here that is related to that. Here, the way I see it, a person who was later to become a great Sufi master imposed a spiritual practice on himself designed to erode his false sense of self. A little bit drastic, as you can see when I read it now. I've quoted this before once or twice in talks. It's such a beautiful story. Wandering in a patchwork robe, as the dervishes, the wandering Sufis, wore very just woolen old clothes. Wandering in a patchwork robe, his face blackened by the sun, a certain dervish arrived at Kufa, where he was seen by a merchant. The merchant spoke to him and decided that he must be a lost slave. And the merchant said to him, "Because of your mild manner, I will call you Khair," which means good. "Are you not a slave?" "That I am," said Khair. "I will take you home and you can work for me until I find your master." "I would like that," said Kaya, "for I have been seeking my master for such a long time." He worked for many years with this man who taught him to be a weaver, hence his second name, Nasaj, weaver. After his long services, feeling guilty of his exploitation, the merchant said to him, "I do not know who you are, but you are now free to go." Kaya Nasaj, the great master of the way, traveled onward to Mecca without regrets, for he had discovered how to continue his development in spite of having no name and being treated like a slave. He was a teacher of Shibli, Ibrahim Kavas, and many more of the great teachers of the Sufis. He died over 1,000 years ago at the age of 120. The way I see this is that not only, as the narrator says of this story, says here, he traveled onwards to Mecca without regrets, for he had discovered how to continue his development in spite of having no name and being treated like a slave. Well, one could say that, but it would be even more true to say it is precisely not in spite of having no name and being treated like the slave that he was able to go so deeply beyond form and identification with form. So it was a conscious attempt, as I see it, on the part of this who was to become a great master. It was a conscious attempt by him to surrender his ego, to have his ego eroded. And so he accepted this. When the man said, "You will be my slave," he said, "Yes, fine." And then for years he was virtually nobody. Now, there are certain dangers associated with consciously creating situations that are designed to erode your ego. Very often, in a very subtle way, the fact that you are consciously creating a situation for yourself designed to erode your ego can bring up a more subtle ego at the back of your mind, which claims credit for having obtained that and created that. Because you have achieved egolessness. I did it. And then you would have another, more subtle ego come in there without knowing it. That is the danger when you consciously engineer situations designed to break down the ego in you. Not that many people actually do that, especially these days, who would consciously bring about situations to erode their ego. Most people, of course, are engaged in the opposite direction. They are consciously creating situations to enhance their ego. But sometimes it seems to work in history. With this person, it worked. Although he consciously did it, as I see it, there was not a secondary subtle ego that developed at the back of him that substituted the more obvious ego. No, in his case, it actually worked. It can work. The same thing, of course, underlies the ancient tradition of giving up which to some extent is still alive in India, giving up your family, leaving your family, giving up your social position, leaving behind your possessions, and then going off and become a mendicant And some people, a few still do it in India when they reach a certain age. But the tradition goes back thousands of years. It's a beautiful tradition. And some people do it at a young age. They try to give up everything. It's again an attempt to be nobody. And sometimes, because it's only if you realize your essential nobodiness as form, can you realize your essential timeless and sacredness as non-form. And sometimes it works, and at other times it doesn't. And when it doesn't, of course, it doesn't work because somebody claims credit there. A subtle ego comes in. And sometimes, of course, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend to anybody to seek situations that erode your ego unless you feel called upon to do that. Allow life to do it. Surrender to the present moment. Become aware of resistance patterns inside yourself and the many subtle forms the ego can take. And accept what life gives you. Accept the situations and the challenges that life gives you. It will give you always what you need. Instead of complaining about situations that life gives you, welcome the situations that life gives you. And if you welcome the situations that life gives you, you are eroding your ego. Or rather, better said, your ego is becoming eroded. You can't actively erode the ego. You can only allow the ego to dissolve. If you actively want to erode your ego, you get definitely more ego. And here we have a similar situation in the next little story, where a teacher gave a disciple, certain things to do, also designed to erode the ego in the person. So here it says, Shibli, who later became a great teacher, but at the time he was a disciple, he was an aristocrat, wealthy and influential, but he was drawn to the Sufi teacher called Junaid, and he was seeking real knowledge. And he said to the teacher, I hear that you have the divine knowledge. Give it or sell it to me. And the teacher said, I cannot sell it to you because you do not possess its price. I cannot give it to you because thus you would have it too cheap. You must immerse yourself in water as I have in order to obtain the pearl. In other words, you must go through the transformation to obtain it. You cannot have it the way you are now. The ego cannot, because the ego wanted it. What shall I do then? Asked the Shibli, the disciple. And so the master said, go and become a seller of sulfur. When a year had passed, Junaid said to him, the teacher said to him, you are flourishing as a merchant. Now be a dervish, doing nothing other than begging. Shibli spent a year begging in the streets of Baghdad without any success. I don't know what the narrator means without any success. He probably means his ego was still big. He went back to Junaid. The master told him, to mankind you are now nothing. Let them be nothing to you. Still the difference. To mankind you are now nothing. Now let them be nothing to you. In the past you were a governor. Return now to that province and seek out every person whom you oppressed. Ask the forgiveness of each one. So he went, found them all except one, and received their pardon. On his return, Dunaid said that he still felt in some way self-important. So the disciple had enough self-knowledge, he had enough awareness to detect in himself that he still had a feeling of self-importance, ego. So he was to spend another year in begging. The money which he gained in this way was brought each evening to the master, who gave it to the poor. Shibli himself got no food until the following morning. He was accepted as a disciple. When a year was over, spent as a servant of the other students, he felt himself to be the most humble of creation. And that was when his apprenticeship was over and he himself became a teacher. So this true humility that he experienced was the end of the ego. From the point of view of the ego, of course, that is a place of weakness. Of course, the reality is that he accessed the point of true power in himself. And so he became a teacher. Wonderful, you can see how universal these spiritual teachings are. It's always the same truth, the same obstacle, the same truth. Now, for the last part of our session, I have some delightful poems by the Sufi teacher and poet Hafiz, who lived around the 13th century. And every poem is a teaching. It's alive, it's vitally alive. The story of Hafiz is interesting. There's a legendary version of how he became a poet and a spiritual teacher, and then if you can look through the legend, you can actually discern the reality behind the legend. I'll just briefly tell you the legend, because that's an instruction in itself, it's a teaching in itself. The legend says that Hafiz was about 20 years old, from a poor background. He was working in a baker's shop as an assistant, and every morning he would have to deliver bread to different households. And one day he delivered bread to a big mansion of a wealthy aristocrat or wealthy merchant, and he saw the daughter of this man was extremely beautiful and extremely refined, and he madly fell in love with her, although he couldn't even talk to her because she was so far removed from where he was in social position. So he fell deeply in love with this beautiful, seemingly unattainable girl, and he started writing poems, love poems to her. And the poems, he turned out poems one after another. And the poems quickly, people, whether he recited them aloud or wrote them down, I don't know, but other people picked them up and very quickly spread throughout the city where he lived. And people would recite his love poems. Maybe they didn't even know they were by him, I don't know. So also he realized that it was virtually impossible for him to even meet this girl, because not only was his social class far below hers, he was also short and ugly. So he was not handsome, so not what else to do. Then he heard the story that you could go to, if you spent 40 vigils, nights, without sleeping, next to the grave of a famous saint, so the story went, if you were able to spend 40 nights and keep awake during 40 successive nights at the grave of a famous saint, you could ask for anything. God would give you any prize. So he decided that that was the best solution for him to obtain the love of this girl. So during the day he still had his job delivering bread and helping in the baker's shop, and he would spend 40 nights, it's a legend, staying awake by the side of by the grave of this saint. And the last night, the 40th night, towards the end of that night, the Archangel Gabriel appeared to him in great splendor and said, "What is it that you want?" And he looked at the Archangel and was so amazed by the radiance of that being. He thought, if that is the Archangel, what is God like? And so, without even knowing it, what came out of his mouth, and he no longer said, "I want the love of that girl." What do you want? He said, "I want God." And then the Archangel Gabriel said, "Then go and see that master tomorrow." So he went to see the Sufi, his famous Sufi master, lived in the town the next day, and became a disciple for many, many years. And that was the beginning of his spiritual awakening. And even while he was the apprentice, while he was a disciple, he turned out poems. And they were no longer poems to a girl, they were poems to God, or the transcendent dimension, all pointing to that. And he was encouraged by his master to write poems. His master himself was also a poet. Here we have the legend. And so he obtained, gradually, after many years, he himself became not only a very famous poet, but also a great master. If we look through the legend to the reality that's probably hiding behind it, we can see that it is probably true that he had an obsessive love, totally consumed by a love for the unobtainable girl. It's probably also true that he came from a low social background and that he was short and ugly. So we have often times when it happens to human beings, when there is something in their lives that they regard as very important, but something fundamental they are deprived of in life. A huge chunk that would usually be regarded as necessary for one's fulfillment. For example, some form of physical disability, or some other great thing that they're deprived of in life, the love of parents. Something that is regarded as fundamental, and that is missing. A huge chunk of, one would say, it makes up a complete life is missing, as if something had been taken away from them. And I believe that was the case with him. The love was not reciprocated, there was no chance of it ever being reciprocated. And then you can either, when something like that happens, you're deprived of something that you regard as vital, or would normally be regarded as vital for one's fulfillment, to lead a fulfilled life. There are two possibilities. Either you become a bitter, angry person and feel sorry for yourself, or angry at God or other people, or you break through that, you break through to a deeper level because of this vital hole in your life. And this hole, when you go into it, takes you into the formless. And if you run away from it, you suffer. By saying go into it means if you surrender and accept that's how it is, and all negativity dissolves and all complaining dissolves, then you go into the hole, and then that huge chunk that was missing from your life, that otherwise one would regard as something that prevents you from being happy and fulfilled, becomes the very entry point into the deeper dimension. And so I believe that's what happened to him. And later it became that legend. It's a beautiful legend, and it still contains the essential truth. After Hafiz died, for many hundreds of years, people would go to his grave on pilgrimage, and hundreds of thousands of people would continuously over the years visit his grave, and that went on for hundreds of years. So here speaks Hafiz in one of his poems. The title of this poem is I Have Learned So Much. I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known. What a beautiful poem, expressing in words that which is beyond words. Expressing in words the dissolution of the whole conceptual structures in his mind, going into formlessness and realizing his essential identity as that transcendent dimension. So he's not even saying, I'm a pure soul. That's still a concept. He's not saying, I've become an angel. It's a concept. It's certainly not a man or a woman. Sometimes he talks in his poems about certain egoic patterns that are unrecognized because they're so normal. And by writing a little poem about them, he can help people to become aware of those unconscious patterns that separate them from the dimension of depth. This poem is called The Sad Game. Blame keeps the sad game going. It keeps stealing all your wealth, giving it to an imbecile with no financial skills. Dear one, wise up. A very common egoic strategy, of course, a strategy of the ego by which it perpetuates and strengthens itself, is blame. So he says, blame keeps the sad game going. It keeps stealing all your wealth. You're giving it to an imbecile with no financial skills. Dear one, wise up, become wise, wake up. Blaming. So if you can, any kind of blame, an favorite egoic way of strengthening itself and strengthening the illusion. So you can detect whenever you're blaming people, situations, events, the weather, whatever it is, it keeps you trapped in illusion. Here another little poem not about God, but about the obstacle to God, in the same as the previous one we just read. The obstacle to realization. This little poem is called Stop Being So Religious. What do sad people have in common? It seems they have all built a shrine to the past, and often go there and do a strange wail and worship. What is the beginning of happiness? It is to stop being so religious like that. Stop worshipping the past. Don't go to that shrine anymore. Stop being so religious like that. There's also, the wonderful thing is there's a lot of humor in many of these poems. A lovely one here. A still cup, a still cup. For God to make love, for the divine alchemy to work, the pitcher needs a still cup. Why ask Hafiz to say anything more about your most vital requirement? I'll read it one more time. For God to make love, for the divine alchemy to work, the pitcher needs a still cup. Why ask Hafiz to say anything more about your most vital requirement? That's all that's needed. The pitcher, God can only give if the cup is still. That's all that needs to be said. That is your most vital requirement. Be still and know that I am God. Nothing else is needed. Here again, using humor as a device. The title of this poem is If You Don't Stop That. I used to live in a cramped house with confusion and pain. But then I met the friend in Sufi language is God. But then I met the friend and started getting drunk and singing all night. Confusion and pain started acting nasty, making threats with talk like this. If you don't stop that, all that fun, we are leaving. So many beautiful poems. Where is the door to God? In the sound of a barking dog, in the ring of a hammer, in a drop of rain, in the face of everyone I see. And here a beautiful teaching poem, a little bit longer. Becoming human. Once a man came to me and spoke for hours about his great visions of God he felt he was having. He asked me for confirmation, saying, "Are these wondrous dreams true?" I replied, "How many goats do you have?" He looked surprised and said, "I am speaking of sublime visions, and you ask about goats?" And I spoke again, saying, "Yes, brother, how many do you have?" "Well, Hafiz, I have 62. "And how many wives?" Again he looked surprised, then said, 4. "How many rose bushes in your garden? How many children? Are your parents still alive? Do you feed the birds in winter?" And to all he answered. Then I said, "You asked me if I thought your visions were true. I would say that they were if they make you become more human, more kind to every creature and plant that you know." So here, wonderful teaching in this poem. What is the criterion for true spiritual realization? Great visions that you see, or some other experience that you have? The criterion is your behavior in everyday life. Your goats, your wives, or wife, and whatever else you deal with, people, plants, animals. If your spiritual realization or your visions do not transform that, if there's not the love and the joy, then there is no transformation. So I believe that this poem was an actual situation that Hafiz experienced. I'm sure it almost literally tells you this interaction with that man who came to him. So that's always the question, how does it affect what is your daily life? What is your relationship to people?
Have you forgotten who you are? Have you wandered so far? No trace of ancient story, but a tragedy of
Isn't it wonderful? Every little poem is an energy, and it's a teaching, it's an energy field that goes into you. Transformational. The sun once glimpsed God's true nature and has never been the same. Thus, that radiant sphere constantly pours its energy upon this earth, as does he from behind the veil. With a wonderful God like that, why isn't everyone a screaming drunk? Hafiz's guess is this: any thought that you are better or less than another man quickly breaks the wine glass. Again, pointing to a very common obstacle. Any thought that you are better or less than somebody else quickly breaks the wine glass. The wine is the joy of God, the power of God. And he compares here, of course, the sun with God. The sun once glimpsed God's true nature and has never been the same. Thus that radiant sphere constantly pours its energy upon this earth. As does he, God, from behind the veil, the unmanifested. With a wonderful God like that, why isn't everyone a screaming drunk? Which really means, what he means is drunk with joy and aliveness and the fullness of life. And one reason is because of this simple thought that you compare yourself to others. In other words, the conceptual reality in your head prevents you from that realization. It's always that, in whatever form it takes. And here we have one of the most famous and beautiful poems by him. I've quoted it once or twice before in talks. I am a hole in a flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to this music. I am a hole in a flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to this music. He's not saying, I'm a flute. I'm a hole in a flute. Because if he said, I'm a flute, he would have given himself a reality in form, identity in form. But if you're a hole in a flute, you have no form identity. And it's only because you realize your essential formlessness, God's breath can move through and play that music. There's a second part to this poem, which I'll read, and then we have the complete poem. I am a hole in a flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to this music. I am the concert from the mouth of every creature, singing with the myriad chords. great power. All these poems written from a place of stillness and realization, very rare. And he produced hundreds of them. Well, he didn't, they came through him. And they're all teachings. So these are the Sufis. There's another very famous Sufi poet, Rumi, and perhaps one day we'll spend a session with his poems. All the words point ultimately not to themselves, but beyond themselves. They're all pointing to the transcendent dimension. So, as that poem that we read a little earlier says, don't ask me to say anything else. All you really need to know is that you need to be still. The cup needs to be still. Maybe I should get up and do a whirling dance. I won't, but that might be appropriate. Thank you for being with me, being with yourself, really.